Hi everyone, it's Alice, and today we are gonna take a look at my favorite books from the past 5 years. So I actually did this exact video in 2019, which is now 5 years ago, which feels wrong. Time is just, it's a thing. But it is 5 years ago since I made that video-ish, and in that video I talked about my favorite books from 2014 to 2018, and then in this video we're gonna do from 2019 until 2023. It's always fun for me to look back at what I've read in previous years and see what really stands out to me, although to be fair 2023 was not that long ago, so it's not that long ago since I read those books, but you know what I mean. And I feel like not all 5-star reads ends up being lifelong favorites, but today I'm going to share the ones from those years that really still stand out to me. I'm only doing fiction for this, and I'm limiting myself to 3 books a year, so these are really the ones that I have loved. And I'm also not including rereads, so it's all books that I read for the first time in that year. Let's of course start with the year of 2019. You know, the year before we'd all lived through a global pandemic, and it's like it is 5 years ago, and it feels somehow both longer and shorter ago somehow. I feel like a lot of those years in between just kind of disappeared, but also it's been ages. But I read some really good books that year, and the first one that I want to mention is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This is a classic closed circle mystery set on an island where 10 strangers gather after having all been invited by this eccentric billionaire to go there. And they seem to have nothing in common, but they all secretly have a really dark past. And when they get to the island, they soon realize that someone has gathered them there to basically kill them off one by one. This is probably my favorite mystery book that I've ever read. It is so well done without being overdone, and it's just really clever. The setting is amazing, the characters are amazing. I love how the book gets progressively darker as you go, and to me this is such a good book that it's one of those books that you could easily reread loads of times even though you know what's gonna happen. It's just brilliant and really clever. Secondly, we have another classic. It is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, which of course is set in 19th century Russia, where we follow Anna Karenina, who is a married woman who has this intense love affair that shocks Russian society. We follow Levin, who is a farmer at heart but pines for a woman who has turned him down, and we also follow the married Oblonskys, whose marriage is ravaged by the husband's constant infidelity. I just remember really falling into this story, and I just loved all of the characters and following them. And I think this is really clever in the way that you get to see different characters' perspectives on the same situations, and there's a lot of misunderstandings and people interpret things differently, and it makes for really interesting sort of interpersonal relationships between the characters. I also loved the writing. I especially loved the descriptions of nature and all of that. It's very romantic in a way, and I just felt really sucked into this. Obviously, it's a little bit of a chunker, so it is slow in parts, but I felt like it was just worth every page. Then we have Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This is a historical fiction novel set in North Carolina in the 50s and 60s, and we follow this young girl who is determined to make it by herself, living out in the marsh, and her life is like the stuff of legend in the closest town. And so when a dead body turns up, like the dead body of a local is found in 1969, everyone suspects the infamous Marsh Girl. Now, there is a mystery element in here, obviously, but the story really focuses on this main character and following her throughout her childhood and seeing her navigate life as a young woman and just seeing her make this life for herself out in the marsh and her dealing with isolation and loneliness, it was just both amazing and heartbreaking. It's one of those books where when I was reading it, I felt like I could picture the whole book as like a movie in my head, and it was so atmospheric. And yes, I do know that they made a movie adaptation of this, which I didn't really like. So I would recommend the book because I think the book is much better. Moving on to 2020, which was quite the year for a lot of other things, but on the reading front, it was an excellent year for me. I read so many good books that year. First up here, we have Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. This is a contemporary novel set in Shaker Heights, which is a suburb in Cleveland where everything is just so. And we meet a family who decide to let their rental home to a single mother and her daughter. And as the story progresses, their lives become more and more entangled with each other, and all of this resentments and all of these secrets start coming to the surface. This is a character-driven novel, and I just loved the characters in here. And I remember thinking, like, this author can really write characters because they just feel so real, and she's so good at crafting them. And I loved following them, especially the mothers in here, because they're very, very different from each other, and seeing them sort of come together in a way was just very interesting. This is also a book that has a lot of elements to it, but it never felt messy to me. It just felt like life, and I just loved it. The second one I have from this year is Call Me By Your Name by André Aciman, and this is a romance slash coming of age novel, I would say, and it's set in the Italian Riviera, where this sudden and intense romance blossoms between an adolescent boy and this man who is staying with the family as a house guest for the summer. This just felt really intimate and painful, and it's a story of a person coming to terms with themselves, and it's also a story of this life-defining romance, and it's about love and sex and everything in between, and it's just so good. Like, the writing is amazing, and I feel like all of the writing in here is just loaded with emotion in a way that you don't really find with a lot of other authors, and it is really, really intense. And it's so intense that it's almost a little bit difficult to get out of because it just takes you right in. The last one I have from this year is They Were Sisters by Dorothy Whipple, which is a classic novel set in England, mostly in the years between the First and the Second World War, and we meet three sisters who we follow, and we follow their fates as they end up marrying three very different men. I love Dorothy Whipple and her books, and this is my favorite one that I've read by her. This is again a very character-driven book, and it's very like slice of life, like that's the vibe. And we follow these three sisters throughout a huge portion of their lives, and we see their relationships with these men, but we also see the relationships between the sisters, which I just loved. And although it is a domestic book in a lot of ways and it follows domestic life, there are some darker elements in here that I thought were really, really interesting. I just think this is an excellent novel with excellent female characters. Next, we have got the year of 2021, and here we are starting with Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce. This is a historical fiction novel set in the 1950s, and it starts off in England, where we meet this woman in her 50s who's a school teacher, she's a spinster, and she's barely making her way through life, like she's barely surviving. And one day she just has enough, and she just leaves her life. She leaves her job, and she decides to chase the only dream that she's ever had, which is the dream of finding this golden beetle, which supposedly exists on the other side of the world. And so she wants to go on this expedition, but she can't go alone, and she needs an assistant, and she ends up with this woman who is nothing like she expected, but they kind of just have to make do, and off they go. This has some of my favorite elements to it. It's not just about unlikely friendship, but it's also about female friendship, and it's an adventure story. Like, these women go on this adventure, and I just loved following the characters. And it is fun and also funny at times, but it's also desperately sad in parts, and I just loved it. Like, it's such a good story, and it has a lot of elements to it, but I just loved every single page. Like, I couldn't get enough of this book, and I think about it all the time. Like, it's so good. Next, we have This Green and Pleasant Land by Ayisha Malik, and this is a contemporary fiction novel following a man who lives with his wife in this sleepy English village. But then his mother calls him to her when she's on her deathbed, and her dying wish is for him to build a mosque in this tiny little village, which obviously, when he tries to do that, causes a little bit of a stir. I think this is such an underrated book, and I wish more people would read it. The backdrop of the small community is excellent, and we get to meet so many different people in this village, and we get to see their perspectives and their development throughout the story. And it's very much a book about home and what home means, but also it's about racism and identity and community and friendship, and it's just so good. And there's one character in particular from this book that has really stuck with me, that I think about all the time, and I really want more people to read this book so that they can meet her, because she's amazing. Then we have The Song of Achilles by Madeleine Miller, which is set in Greece during the Age of Heroes, and we meet this awkward young prince named Patroclus, who is exiled from his home and sent to live in the court of this other king, who happens to be the father of Achilles, who is to become his lifelong companion and eventually take him to Troy. This is a love story at its core, but it has a lot of other things in it as well. There's loads of drama and intrigue and history and mythology, and I just loved it. I think the thing that really does it for me is the writing in here, which again is just like, it's so good, and there's so much emotion to it, and I just loved it. It's the kind of book that will break your heart a little bit, but sometimes reading good books will do that to you. Then we have made it to 2022, which really was not a good reading year for me. I feel like I was kind of in a reading slump for most of the year, but I did manage to read some gems when I was reading, and one of those were Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This is historical fiction. It's set in the late 1500s, and we meet a woman named Agnes, who is quite the unusual woman with unusual gifts, and she marries this man, and they have 3 children together, and then one of the children dies, and this tragedy threatens to just tear their lives apart. This is one of those books though where I absolutely loved the writing. Like, when I started reading this book, immediately I was like, okay, this is it. I love this. But the writing isn't for everyone, I feel, because it's really descriptive, and it does probably slow down the book a little bit. But for me, it was perfect because it's a character-driven book, and I just loved all of the writing, and I just feel like it added so much to the story. And I just felt really sucked into this, and I loved reading about the characters, and it's just excellent. It's my favorite kind of writing, but I know that it's not everyone's favorite. The second book from this year is also kind of not for everyone. It's Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which is a fantasy novel, and it follows this woman who survives this horrible tragedy, and after that she is offered a place at Yale. And it's kind of like weird that she's offered a place because she didn't finish high school and she never applied, but someone comes to her and offers her a place. The only thing she has to do is monitor the school's secret societies, and they get up to all kinds of occult, magical stuff and weird stuff, to be honest. And then her mentor goes missing, and she is determined to find him. It's hard to really summarize this book because there's a lot going on in it, but it's basically just dark, dark, dark academia. And it's kind of insane, but I loved it. I love the setting, I love the characters, I love like the magical, occult, weird stuff, and I really love the fact that it's as dark as it is, but I think it's too dark for a lot of people. But I just adore this book, and I wish I could read 100 more books like this because the vibes are just amazing. The last one that I have from this year, though, is kind of the opposite of dark. It's Garlic and the Vampire by Bree Paulsen, which is a graphic novel, and it follows this little character named Garlic, who is a garlic person living in a village of vegetable folk, and she's very anxious and becomes more anxious when a vampire moves into the neighborhood, and the village folk are like, someone needs to go confront the vampire, and they decide to send Garlic because she's garlic. This is peak autumn vibes, and you all know how much I love autumn, and like the color palette is really autumnal, and it's just lovely. I love the art in here. I love all of the colors and the characters and how they're drawn, and it's just such a sweet book. It is kind of like a simple story, but if you ever need to read a book to like cheer you up, this is the book. It's perfect for that. Finally, we've made it to 2023, and obviously I made a video not that long ago about my favorite books from last year, so I'm not going to talk about these books too much, but I have picked 3 that I feel like are going to be lifelong favorites, and they're the ones out of the ones that I've read that I'm thinking about the most. First up here we have, of course, Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is historical fiction, and it does have a sci-fi element to it, but that element is really just time travel, and that's where the sci-fi ends. It's mostly historical fiction. And we're following this woman who's living in modern times, but is suddenly yanked back in time to the early 1800s in the American South. And the first time she travels there, I guess, she saves the life of this plantation owner's son. And as the story goes on, she sort of travels back and forth. I feel like travel is not the right word because she has no control over it. But she goes back and forth in time, and every time she goes back, she meets the same boy who eventually grows into a man. The concept of this alone is great, but it's just so well done. It's a really, really well crafted story, and it really shows what an amazing writer Butler is, because there are so many layers to this book, and you could discuss it for hours because there's so much going on in it, but nothing feels forced. It just feels like it's baked into the story really well, and I loved the characters, I loved the setting, and I love how there is a lot of tension in this book because the time element really like adds a lot of tension to it, and I just think it's really, really well crafted. The next one I have is The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty, and this is a fantasy adventure book, and I love it. It follows this retired female pirate who comes out of retirement when she is presented with this task, and like finishing that will make her infamous, but it'll also make her really, really rich. And she goes off on this final adventure, and of course not everything is as easy as it seems, and there's a lot going on, and this quest takes her to places that she could have never even imagined. This is not just a really good book with like great characters and all these amazing settings, it's also just so much fun. Like, it's pure entertainment from start to finish, and you really do feel like you're going on an adventure, and it's just amazing escapism. There's so much going on in here. There's pirates, treasure, magical artifacts, and ancient mysteries, and a couple of demons. Like, there's a lot going on in here, and it's just such a wild ride, but it's also a really good one. Then at the very end here, we have Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett, which is fantasy, historical fiction, and it follows the scholar who is working on this encyclopedia of fae and fairy lore. And she goes on this research trip and is soon joined by her rival slash friend, and he shows up uninvited and sort of unannounced. But they kind of go on an adventure as well. They do research and they find themselves getting pulled more and more into the fairy realm. This is a really fun book, and it has adventure elements to it, and it has cozier elements to it, and it feels like a cozy read, but it does have some darker elements to it. And I loved the characters, I love the humor and the banter, and just the exploration of this magical world and all of this lore that is in the book. Like, I really, really like that. It's just a really good book. Again, really good escapism. Okay, that was a lot of books, but we made our way through all of them. Now, I'd love to hear what your favorite reads from the past 5 years have been, what they're about, why you love them so much, and why they stuck with you. That's kind of it for this video, though. As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!